let's get right into it. When you think about the most common prescriptions out there today, second-generation antidepressants are way up on the list. And it makes sense, right? Depressive and anxiety disorders are incredibly prevalent, so chances are you or someone you know is taking one of these. They're a world away from the older treatments, and that's what we're going to unpack. Now, there's a really good reason they're so popular. Compared to the first-generation drugs, these newer medications are a whole lot safer, especially in an overdose. That's a huge leap forward for sure. But, and this is the key thing I want you to take away from the get-go, safer is a relative term. It absolutely does not mean these powerful drugs are without their own unique dangers. And those dangers are serious enough to get the FDA's heaviest warning, the black box warning. You know, that's not something they hand out lightly. What's really striking here is who it's for, patients younger than 24. For this group, the data showed these drugs could have this paradoxical effect. They could actually increase suicidal thoughts. It's just a really sobering reminder of how incredibly complex brain chemistry is. So, to really get a handle on these drugs, we've got to break them down. Let's start with a group that's kind of defined by not fitting in anywhere else. These are the atypical antidepressants. You can think of this as the miscellaneous category. Each one is a bit of a lone wolf. The key word to describe this group is heterogeneous. That's the scientific way of saying they're a real mixed bag. Unlike other classes of antidepressants that all work in a similar way, these guys are all over the place. Different chemical structures, different mechanisms in the brain, and that means the side effects and overdose risks, for one, can be completely different from the next. And this table really drives that point home. Just look at the variety. You've got bupropion, where the big, scary thing in an overdose is seizures. Then there's trazodone, which is much more likely to cause heavy sedation and a sudden drop in blood pressure. And mirtazapine, mostly sedation and confusion. See what I mean? One category, but three very different danger profiles. Let's zoom in on bupropion for a second, because it's a perfect example of why these specifics are so critical. It has what we call a narrow therapeutic index. All that means is that the line between a dose that helps you and a dose that hurts you is razor thin. Seizures are the #1 risk, and they can kick in at doses just barely over the recommended max. And here's the really tricky part. With the extended release versions, that seizure might not even happen for up to a full 24 hours after someone takes the pills. Okay, now let's shift gears to the next major category, and these are the ones you've probably heard the most about. We're talking about the two big players, the SSRIs and the SNRIs. Unlike that miscellaneous group of atypicals, these drugs are all grouped together for a reason. They share a primary target, the neurotransmitter serotonin. So what's the mechanism here? It's actually pretty clever. In your brain, serotonin acts like a little messenger, carrying signals between your nerve cells. Once it delivers its message, a sort of cleanup crew comes in to sweep it away. Well, SSRIs and SNRIs basically tell that cleanup crew to take a break. They block them. This leaves more of those serotonin messengers hanging around, so the signal gets amplified, it's louder, and lasts longer. So what's the difference between the two? It's right there in the name. SSRI stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor. It's a specialist. It selectively goes after the serotonin cleanup crew. SNRIs, that's serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, they do that same job, but they also block the cleanup of another messenger, norepinephrine, which is tied to alertness and energy. So you can think of it as a 2-for-1 kind of deal. Now, here is the most important thing to know about SSRIs and SNRIs in an overdose. When they are taken alone, and I can't stress that word enough, alone, they are actually pretty safe. Unlike bupropion, their therapeutic index is high. Fatalities are rare. The symptoms are usually pretty mild, maybe some drowsiness or a fast heartbeat. But, and this is a massive but, that safety net disappears the second you mix them with other drugs that also ramp up serotonin. And that leads us to the single biggest risk that ties almost all of these newer antidepressants together. It's a condition called serotonin syndrome. And if you're going to know about these drugs, you need to know about this. So what in the world is serotonin syndrome? The name sounds a little clinical, but what we're talking about is a very specific and potentially lethal medical emergency. It's all about serotonin overload. Put simply, serotonin syndrome is serotonin toxicity. It's what happens when you have way too much of that serotonin messenger just flooding the system. This isn't some rare allergic reaction. It's a predictable, toxic effect of having too much serotonin activity in the brain and body. And when it happens, it shows up in a classic pattern, a triad of symptoms. First, you see mental status changes. The person gets agitated, confused, restless. Second, the autonomic nervous system goes haywire. This is the system that controls all your automatic functions. So you see things like a high fever, a racing heart, and tons of sweating. And third, you get neuromuscular problems, muscle stiffness, overactive reflexes, and this classic muscle jerking called myoclonus. You know, these neuromuscular signs are absolutely key for telling it apart from other serious conditions that can look similar, like neuroleptic malignant syndrome. With serotonin syndrome, think hyper. The reflexes are overactive and you see that clonus, that twitching or jerking. With NMS, it's the opposite. The muscles get stiff as a board, we call it lead pipe rigidity, and the reflexes actually become slow and sluggish. It's a critical distinction to make in the ER. And you have to understand, this thing exists on a spectrum. It can start out pretty mild, maybe just a little agitation, some tremors, but it can escalate, and fast. The real red flag, the number you have to watch, is the temperature. A fever over 104 degrees Fahrenheit means things are getting serious. And if it climbs past 106, well, that's a life-threatening emergency, often with delirium and extreme rigidity. So what kicks this whole thing off? As we've been saying, it's almost always a combination of drugs that all boost serotonin. And it's not just about mixing two different antidepressants. This is the part a lot of people miss. Common, over-the-counter stuff can be a culprit too. A perfect example is dextromethorphan. Yep, the main ingredient in a lot of cough syrups. Okay, that was a lot of information, I know. We've gone from the risks of specific drugs to this big, overarching danger of serotonin syndrome. So let's just boil it all down to the absolute must-know bottom line points. So here's what you need to remember. 1. Safer never, ever means safe. Every single one of these drugs has risks. 2. Know the specific risks for your particular medication. A seizure risk is a totally different beast than a sedation risk. 3. The biggest danger isn't usually the single drug, but mixing it with other things that work on serotonin. And 4, learn to spot the early signs of serotonin syndrome, that classic trio of agitation, fever, and weird muscle stuff like jerking or stiffness. Look, the point of all this isn't to scare you. It's about building awareness. These medications are life-changing for millions, but they demand our respect. Knowing the risks and being able to spot the warning signs, that's the first and most important step to using them safely. So the real question to ask yourself is, after all this, do you think you could spot those signs?